The topic this morning is about the scientific contributions of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Much that's been written about the expedition until relatively recent times has been about the cartography and about the discoveries in the ethnographic areas. Much of that information obviously was very important to the government after the expedition for purposes of both military maneuvers and for exploration and subsequently economic development. The remainder of the scientific materials of the Lewis and Clark expedition, however, constitute a totally different story, and it's that story I want to tell this morning. When Thomas Jefferson was in the government long before he was president, he had made several efforts to spur exploration of the Mississippi West and to explore the western part of the country, and had actually tried to get people like George Rogers Clark and John Ledyard, Andrew Michaud, others to go and explore the West in a variety of ways, some surreptitiously, some actually encouraged by the American Philosophical Society, of which Jefferson was a member. None of these trips, for various reasons that I won't go into this morning, occurred, obviously. And it was in around 1801 that Jefferson hired Meriwether Lewis to be his secretary. Lewis had a background in Western travels. He'd been in the Army, the Whiskey Rebellion times. He'd been a colleague of Clark, as you heard this morning. He was a frontiersman. He was a curious kid. Had attended a Latin school for 4 years, I believe. He had been pretty carefully nurtured by his mother, who was an herb doctor, the best kind of doctor in those days. And he had a tremendous, and if I had to say the most important thing about him, the most unique thing, he had the tremendous power of observation of things. You see this with scientists today. They're the ones that make the great discoveries. The rest just do the technical work, and that's the bulk of us. But Lewis had this uncanny ability to spot things, to see relationships. And I want to show you about a few of those discoveries this morning. Lewis, about the time of the purchase of the Louisiana Territory in 1803, was sent to Philadelphia to see a group of individuals that were all colleagues of Jefferson. Jefferson had given Lewis created a very thorough set of objectives for this expedition that he was planning. He had Lewis primed to lead the expedition, and in the process of preparing Lewis, had sent him on then to Philadelphia to see a number of individuals in this list, all of whom were colleagues of Jefferson. Jefferson at the time was the president of the American Philosophical Society, and these people were all members. These were the cream of the crop of the scientific minds. There were others, but these were the ones that Lewis asked for help in preparing for the expedition. Particularly Benjamin Smith Barton, who was a 40-some-year-old physician and botanist. He gave Lewis a crash course in collecting specimens. Lewis had a pretty good background in botany, and as did Thomas Jefferson. Both had great interest in plants. Lewis probably because of his mother's interest as an herb doctor. And Barton gave Lewis other kinds of assistance as a natural history person would, about how to collect specimens, how to preserve them, how to record, and so forth. Lewis got a lot of other help. He got help from Benjamin Rush. This is Rush, a picture of Rush. Rush was really the premier physician of the times of the early 19th century at the College of Pennsylvania, the University of Pennsylvania. And he gave Lewis the instructions principally on how to handle medical care. There were plans to take a physician. They almost did. But some say, fortunately, they didn't. And they managed to survive pretty well without one on this expedition. But Rush gave Lewis pretty good training. Also gave him a lot of ideas about things that could be done in compiling data about the native peoples. This is a portrait of Benjamin Smith Barton. I'll come back to him later, but he was to play the major role after the expedition to receive the materials that were collected and to put those materials together. We'll come back to Benjamin Smith Barton as we finish the expedition. They also made provisions for the purchase of the best equipment of the time for doing their survey and measurements. Instruments were purchased, the bulk of them, at Thomas Whitney's shop in Philadelphia. You probably know the story that there was $2,500 appropriated by Congress for the expedition. They had no indirect cost in those days, so there was no serious problem with that. The most expensive item in the collection of equipment that Lewis had was a chronometer, which had to be brought in from England and cost $250. One of the pieces of equipment Lewis had slight familiarity with was an octant. He used a sextant. They used a sextant primarily for their measurements, but I thought you might, if you hadn't seen an octant, you might like to see what one looked like. The other individuals that Lewis met with gave him primarily information on the measurement of longitude and latitude. And Lewis went on with this information. This was in the summer now of 1803. Went on to Pittsburgh, where he was having a keelboat built. This boat, fortunately, good people of Sioux City, Iowa, rebuilt one of these. It looks like it floats better than the raft the people in Billings built to simulate the Clark descent of the Yellowstone. That one sunk with everybody on it. I'll leave that one alone. Anyhow, this is what this boat looked like, 55-foot boat. Lewis departed with all the supplies down the Ohio River in August. By October, he was in Louisville, where he picked up his other co-captain, William Clark. Clark had a different kind of background. He was more of a frontiersman. He had also been in the Army with Lewis. And he did have a background in surveying and in mapping, and became, of course, as you all know, the great map maker of the expedition. He also was probably the key illustrator of the expedition. A great number of the illustrations in the journals were done by Clark. Both men, with this delegation of soldiers and barge people, headed out, as the story goes, on the 14th of May, 1804, up the Missouri River. Missouri River, of course, had been explored already by a number of people. Lewis and Clark had the benefit of the Evans and McKay map of the Missouri River. They had the benefit of other maps that had been put together with the information that had been gleaned from the explorations of Gray and Vancouver. They had the benefits of the information from the journals of Mackenzie that had just been published in a couple years before. And all of this gave them a kind of open map with a charge to fill in the spaces, fill in the blanks. So as they proceeded up the Missouri River, they began to make their recordings, these wonderful recordings of the journals. We wouldn't be here today without those journals. But what a terrific production that was. Somebody called them the literary crown jewels of America. I'm sure there's a lot of people in English departments that wouldn't agree with that, but they still were the first and foremost of the writers in Montana. We all know that. They began to record and make these observations, and I'm going to show you a few of these just along the way and then come back and talk about what happened afterwards. One of the most important plants that they discovered in the ascent of the Missouri River was recorded in mid-September 1804 at the Big Bend of the Missouri River. It was a plant they found, the Indians, they were with the Teton Sioux about that time. It was a plant they found the Indians were using primarily as a dietary substance for starch or for a principal food base. It was called the Indian turnip or the prairie apple. And you can see here in this illustration what the plant looked like. Here is what it looks like really if you pull it up out of the ground. And it's a plant that they could roast or they could boil it. And it was one of in the Great Plains, it was one of the principal observations that they made in terms of food materials of the Indians, or in this category of ethnobotany. They found similar kinds of plants as they went across the country, and I'll show you just for comparison the different ones all across the route. There's about 5 or 6 of them that will pop up that the native peoples used in these different geographic regions. This plant, by the way, was described by Frederick Persh, who we'll talk about in a few minutes, as a brand new species to science. One of the animals they found that its description revealed the enormous powers of observation of Lewis or some of the people with him that may have been helping, was this bird called the poorwill, the common poorwill. It was in October, near the Mandan village in the area close to present-day North Dakota, where they found this bird and were able to pick it off a rock. It didn't attempt to fly away. And they made the observation that it was hibernating. And you might think that's okay today, because you know about hibernation of things, but in those days, that was something that people didn't believe happened to anything but animals, but mammals, and other kinds of animals, but definitely not to birds. There was some suggestion it might happen with swallows, but generally the belief was it didn't happen with birds. Lewis poked around and prodded on this bird and found out certain things about its heartbeat and so forth, and wrote a wonderful description in the journal about its behavior, and the conclusion was, he said, that it was hibernating. It had gone into a dormant stage. It wasn't until 1946 when Charles Yeager, the ornithologist in California, actually showed clear evidence that certain species of birds could definitely hibernate. The bird was described later in the 1840s by the famous ornithologist John Audubon, and was called, given the scientific name by Audubon that he had at the time. It's been changed since, but Audubon has credit for that. Lewis and Clark had the credit for the discovery, Audubon for the naming. They were at the Mandan village in October, near present-day Bismarck, in that general area. A lot of you have been there, traveled through there, and know this story. They spent the winter there until the following April with the Indians. That was kind of an Indian Wall Street area where all the people came to trade. And the picture I have here is one of those great Carl Bodmer paintings made in the 1830s when he and Maximilian went up the Missouri River. the buffalo dance. I have to call it the bison dance because that's really the correct name for the animal. The American bison at this time circulated through this area. They circled around through the Yellowstone Valley and up through the Great Falls and on up into Alberta, present-day Alberta, over to Saskatchewan. The Great Northern Herd spent its winter in Saskatchewan. And then there was a herd along the Red River in present-day North Dakota, a smaller herd that circled there. And so you can see why the great assemblage of American Indians in that particular spot where the Mandan village was. And of course the great dance was a dance like that many cultures have, getting ready for the harvest. The bison at the time, I just want to throw this slide in to give you an idea of the enormity of the bison population. At the time of Lewis and Clark, there probably were 40 million bison left in the country. By 1895, the number was down to 800. Today, there's a great resurgence of interest both by the Native Americans as well as by non-Native Americans in raising bison in this country. And there are presently, this slide shows a number I had last year, 100,000 bison, but I just spoke to the American Bison Association a couple weeks ago in Oklahoma, and they corrected me and said that now 120,000. So there's a tremendous resurgence of interest. Of course, most of those are Ted Turners over in the Bozeman area. But this, by April, I think around the 7th of April, the keelboat was broken out of the ice and packed and sent back to St. Louis. It contained a great number of things that Lewis and Clark had collected that year. It contained trunks full of notes, letters. They had a number of interesting animals on board that were alive. One of them was this one of these sharp-tailed grouse they'd collected in the area. It was caged. Another was this bird, the black-billed magpie. They had 4 of these. They were all alive, and they were in cages. The Indians used to keep these around as pets around the villages. And probably the most interesting animal they collected was the black-tailed prairie dog. And this animal they had collected on the plains, and and it was an animal that Lewis very properly observed didn't use water. And that is recorded in the journals about how these animals can survive without water, how they get water from seeds and so forth. The other materials that were in the packets of materials that were sent back included seeds, many seeds, and cuttings of plants. There were 60 cataloged herbarium-type sheets with plants that were being sent back to hopefully to Benjamin Smith Barton. And this material, including many skins of animals, skins of the grizzly bear were included, foxes, rabbits. All this material went back to St. Louis. Of course, the sharp-tailed grouse died, and before it got there, and or somewhere on the route. The magpie and the black-tailed prairie dog ended up in Jefferson's home, and eventually in Charles Wilson Peale's museum in Philadelphia. The seeds went to a number of horticulturists, principally William Hamilton and Bernard McMahon in Philadelphia. Jefferson, being a great gardener himself, kept a number of them, and other people got their hands on them as well. The expedition proceeded on, and in the later part of April, we're at the confluence of the Yellowstone River. They were beginning to see the grizzly bear, which they had aptly defined and described, and had sent some skins back of bears. These bear were beginning to plague the expedition by this time, and there are numerous stories about bear encounters. George Ord, naturalist, later took the material from the Lewis and Clark expedition from the Peel Museum and described this bear. It was one of the early descriptions, and of course he called it Ursus horribilis. This map I took from an article by Ken Walczak here in Montana, from Montana Outdoors. I doctored it up a bit. What it is a map of mammal sightings in Montana from the Lewis and Clark journals, and I put a blue dot wherever there was a grizzly bear encounter or sighting. You can see the great number of them at the Great Falls. That's because all the bison crossed the river there in this great circuit around the plains, and they often fell in the river. They also fell through the ice when the ice was thin, and wherever there were bison, dead bison congregating, there were grizzly bear with their fishing or their bear eating sites, their territories, and of course Lewis and Clark and party went right through this, and of course it's no accident that one of the places around the Great Falls is called White Bear Island. Down the White Cliffs area of the Missouri, they proceeded collecting plants. Remember, it was May at this time. They were getting a pretty fair collection of materials. And by the early part of June, they were at the Marias River confluence, where they began to come across some mapping difficulties. They had thought that they were on the right route. When they hit this junction, they saw another great river. You don't see it today if you go up there, of course, you know, just a little trickle. But it was a problem for them, and they were there over a week trying to decide which way to go. Fortunately, they chose the Great Falls route, and otherwise they wouldn't have those museums developing up there, things like that. So this is one of Olaf Seltzer's little miniature prints of how he portrayed the party arriving at the Great Falls. They were here for nearly a month. They arrived at the falls on the 13th of June, Lewis did at least, and they were there about a month. One of the interesting Seltzer paintings is about them looking at this piece of cottonwood with an eagle's nest in it. The Indians had told them to look for this when they were in the Mandan area, and they found it, and the black eagle was there. It was probably a golden eagle. And so Seltzer, from reading the journals, has created this graphic representation. What's interesting about it, from a biological point of view, is that Gilpin, I think it was, I'll go on if I don't have the right name, I think it was Gilpin, who was at Great Falls, had talked to Owen Wheeler years later when Wheeler was retracing the expedition, and it said that the survey parties, when they came through in the 1860s, said that the eagle's nest was still there. The eagles were still coming back. No talk in Montana can go without at least one fish story. The cutthroat trout was caught in great numbers at the Great Falls and described carefully enough by Lewis that in later years, naturalist James Richardson, the British naturalist, was able to name this species, and he named it after both men at the time. It used to be called Salmo lewisi clarki, or clarki lewisi, I can't remember which, but anyhow, the names have changed slightly now because of some taxonomic features, but we'll go past that. The state bird was observed at the Great Falls. It was named later, identified, scientifically named by Audubon. But the western meadowlark, and coming from the east, you would think that Lewis and Clark would have passed this bird out. But they noticed it had a call, wrote about this in their journals, that the number of notes in its call was different from the bird that looked just like it in the east. And today we have an eastern meadowlark and a western meadowlark, very properly so. They're different species, but they look very much alike. In the gates of the mountain in late July, as the expedition headed past the Great Falls, they found this bird, which is now the famous Lewis's woodpecker, and it was found in the area near Helena, and was one of the few actual study skins of birds that were brought back after the expedition. Today, it's probably the only study skin left. It's in the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard University. There were a number of other skins that were brought back and properly prepared and used by different naturalists to make identifications. But most of those were lost in fires or destroyed in various ways. But there is one skin of this bird left. Lewis at Lewis's Lookout at the Three Forks in late July 1805, and looking out at the three rivers as they come in from the south, with the Jefferson on the right, I guess it would be on your left, and you can see the Gallatin up in the top part of the picture coming in from the other side. And this turned out to be one of the great commercial discoveries reported in the journals, because the beaver, which was part of the mission of the expedition, besides crossing the continent, was finding a water route across the continent, was to find out about the fur trade and what could be done and what the possibilities were. The beaver were terrifically abundant in this area. And so it's not surprising to know that some of the Lewis and Clark members, with the support of the St. Louis fur companies, came back to this area to trap immediately after the expedition had ended. They weren't there too long, by the way. The Indians drove the fur trappers out in 1810 and killed one of the members of the Lewis and Clark expedition who was there at the time. Another had been killed a couple of years earlier in the same area. This is the Beaverhead Rock down toward Dillon. They were there in early August. They were at the headwaters of the Beaverhead just a few days later, and off into the Lemhi Pass area, crossing the Continental Divide. They of course, were way off track in terms of their expedition route and running dangerously close to the fall snows in the Bitterroots, which they were to encounter shortly after this. They're meeting finally with the Shoshones, with Sacagawea's people. Kamiiwait, the chief, her brother, was highly fortunate. This took place down in the valley, down where Tendoy, Idaho is today. And they were able finally to get horses. They had abandoned their canoes in the headwaters of the Beaverhead. And they were able to get some information on route, and they proceeded on to the north, coming up this direction. It's interesting to note that in that trip from the Mandan village to the point where they met the Shoshones, they had really never seen, they saw a sign, but they never saw any Indian people. In this general area, this bird, which is a famous bird, was collected. It was collected in other areas as well, but study skins of it were also brought back after the expedition, and it was named Clark's Nutcracker. They also collected a skin of this animal and saw this animal. This was the mountain goat, which was later described by one of the naturalists I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. They were on to Ross's Hole, this famous painting of Charlie Russell, in early September, and by the 12th of September they were crossing the Bitterroot, as seen in this Seltzer painting. They were, as the story goes, and most of you know the story, a number of days out of food, till they finally came to the Weihai Prairie area where they met the Nez Perce and were able to get food from them. The Nez Perce had one of the plants, another plant now that provided a primary staple of the Columbian Plateau Indian tribes. This was camas. And the root of the camas was gathered in the spring or in the early summer, and was fixed in a variety of ways and was a primary source of food. The Lewis and Clark party, the story goes, got sick at this point. They hadn't had much to eat for almost 2 weeks, and either overindulged or got something happened anyhow. Many of the individuals got quite sick eating a combination of camas bulbs and fish. At that time, in September, the salmonid fishes were running up the Clearwater River had come up from the ocean. They proceeded down the Columbia River to Fort Clatsop, where they spent the winter. They, of course, as you heard this morning, did a lot of note-taking, a lot of observations. They had plenty of time to make various kinds of recordings about plants and animals in the area. They saw a lot of different species of fish. It's believed that they also gave the original descriptions to the steelhead salmon, it was called at the time. They found this plant being used by the Chinook Indians quite frequently. It was an edible thistle, and if you took this out of the ground, took the root carefully out of the ground, you got a root that if cooked, boiled, or heated, gave a sweet, starchy taste, and it was used quite frequently for food. Another one that they found, it was found more frequently upriver, slightly up more toward the Longview, present-day Longview area, but one that grew out in the water and kind of like a lily. And this was the arrowhead, which the Indians called wapato. And the root was gathered by the Indian women walking in the swampy areas where the plant grew. They would feel around for the roots with their feet and pull these up and collect them by the bushel basket. So it again was an interesting plant. Neither of these two plants were new species to science, but the camas plant that I showed a moment ago was a brand new species to science, and again was described by Frederick Persch. One of the animals that they saw and described while they were at the fort is this little bird, and I want to read you, since it's a very short description, but I want to give you one-time idea of how Lewis described things. He said that this is from the journals on Friday, March the 7th, 1806. He said there are two species of loons. First, the speckled loon found on every part of the rivers of this quarter. They are the same size, color, and form with those of the Ohio and Atlantic coast. The second species we met with at the Great Falls of the Columbia and from thence down. This bird, and this is the bird, is not more than half the size of the speckled loon. Its neck is long, slender, and white in front. The color of the body and back of the neck and head are a dun or ash color. The breast and belly are white. The back is like that of the speckled loon, and like them it cannot fly, but flutters along on the top of the water or dives for security when pursued. Lewis didn't know about the mating behavior of these birds. They act like they can't fly when they're mating, probably for a good reason, but they dance along the water and so forth. They have a very interesting kind of social behavior. But that's a Lewis description. I thought it might please you to hear how he described something from the journal. On the way back, they were trapped in the what would be the Kamei Clearwater area of Idaho, because the snows hadn't melted and they couldn't get the rest of the way over the pass. They'd started back in March, and they spent the early spring and early part of June in this camp. And so it's not surprising to see, as you look at the Lewis and Clark herbarium collection, that over a quarter of the plants that are in that collection are collected right at this site. Also several of the birds. One of these was this beautiful western tanager, which they named the Kuskuski river bird. Like the Clark's nutcracker and Lewis's woodpecker, its skin was brought back and it was used later by Alexander Wilson to describe new species. Another plant they found in the area that was used by everybody for food was this little kind of plant. You might recognize it as an onion. Here are several different kinds. They saw different kinds along the route, and they're very common. Another plant they found in the area of the Clearwater was this plant, which was called a biscuit root. And if it were dug up, the root could be used and pounded for flour to make dough for bread. They, by the 1st of July, were just south of here at the Travelers Rest area. This is one of two interesting paintings by Edgar Paxton that are here in the Missoula County Courthouse, so I put them in for that purpose in case you have time to, if you haven't seen them, you might want to drive over and take a look at them. But this was their breaking up of the party. Lewis was to go on to the Great Falls, and Clark was to go on to the Three Forks of the Missouri. But a plant they found at that site at Travelers Rest looked like this when it's just in leaf, and you can see the leaves are big, fleshy kinds of things. But when in bloom, it's this beautiful flower with this great root system, and this was a bitter root. And it was later identified by Frederick Persch, given a generic name of Lewisia after Lewis, and rediviva for the fact that the roots, when watered after they'd been dried, came back to life. So rediviva comes back to life. Another one of the great botanical discoveries of the Lewis and Clark expedition. The Indians used this plant, moved in total villages to spots where they could collect it at certain times of the year. It was found over in the Columbia Plateau area on over into to the Bitterroot into the Gallatin Valley. So Lewis left then on his way back to explore the Marias River. And in the process, here he's crossing the Clark Fork just outside this building, downriver a bit, but nevertheless making that crossing. They, by the time they got to the Great Falls, they met the disappointment that the plants and materials they'd cached there, collected all along those beautiful stretches of the Missouri River in the previous May, had been destroyed by water. And so one of the great parts of the Lewis and Clark collection was lost forever. Clark proceeded down the Yellowstone River and, of course, met the Lewis party, and they were back in St. Louis by the 23rd of September. Benjamin Smith Barton, who we talked about a little earlier, looking a little older in this picture, he died when he was 49, and I think in 1815, about a year after the journals were published. And if you read the Biddle editions, which I'm sure Gary will talk about tonight, you'll know that in that edition it's stated that the natural history part of the Lewis and Clark expedition will be published in another chapter, and it was to be published by Benjamin Smith Barton, this man. For some reason, Barton didn't get the material published. He's been accused of overcommitting. He's been accused of being a perfectionist, that he never could get everything just in the right order to finally publish it. And Susan McKelvey, a botanist in this wonderful book in the 1950s called Botanical Discoveries of the Trans-Mississippi West, that she did at Harvard, really comes to his defense and suggests that he may not have published at least the botanical discoveries because Frederick Persch, who had been with him for some time, might, in taking a number of the plants later, have left Barton without a full deck in the sense of the materials. And that's a good idea to think about in terms of what really did go wrong. It's a more pleasant thing in my mind, that a scientist of Barton's stature could have had some decent excuse for not getting this material published. Lewis had taken the material much of the material to Barton. A lot of materials had been given to Barton by Jefferson. They've been processed through the American Philosophical Society. The plants have been cataloged through the society. And the first 60 that came back on the keelboat, Barton had. Persh was a young European botanist that had come to this country. He had worked for Barton for a while, and then he'd come under the employ of Bernard McMahon, who was a horticulturist and a friend of Jefferson's. And Persh had been put in contact with Lewis, and Lewis had come to Persh with some of the plants, asked him to make drawings, had paid him to make some descriptions. And what had happened, and it's a long, involved story, but to make it fit the time we have today, I simply have to say that with Lewis's sudden, unexpected death, Persh went on about his way to get his profession taken care of. As a botanist, he had a set of plants, materials that he'd collected from other places. He wanted to publish a book on this. And he ultimately went to England and apparently took a great number of the Lewis and Clark plants with him, or took pieces and parts of them, took cuttings off the sheets, off the specimens. He went under the employ of A.B. Lambert, who was the vice president of the London Linnean Society. And in that place, by 1814, had assembled this systematic flora of North America, which was a monumental work at the time. It had 123 or 124, I'm not sure of the number, of the Lewis and Clark plants, of which there probably were by this time 200. 60 or so sent back in the first collection, and the rest brought back by Lewis and Clark in 1806. There were 4 new genera. 2 of these he did honorary naming, courtesy that some have criticized Persh for being an opportunistic type of fellow. But he named one of them after Lewis. He named one after Clark. He named 3 different species of plants after Lewis. He had a couple of other genera he had named. One of those stuck. And the 4th one was a synonym with a genus that had been used before by another botanist, and so later a botanist named that plant after Persh. So there is Pershia tridentata, which is a bitterbrush you find in the mountains. But Persh had great drawings and plates. He must have been a wonderful artist. And in the 2-volume set, you'll find several of the Lewis and Clark plants. In fact, the majority of the plants that are drawn that are in these plates, I think there's 27 of them, are Lewis and Clark from the Lewis and Clark collection. One of these was Clarkia. This is the actual drawing. You can see the edge of the book. I had this photographed at the Harvard Rare Books Library a couple years ago when I got my hands on these books for a short time. And this is Clarkia, which, of course, he gave the genus and species name to, which have been collected both over in the Lewiston area and around this area by the explorers. And there it is in the actual photograph. And he named this one Mimulus lewisi. This was one of the 3 plants, syringa and blue flax were the other 2 that he gave species names to Lewis. But this was Lewis's monkey flower. Here it is in real life. A pretty plant. Well, Lewis and Clark had a lot of other materials they brought back with them as part of their discovery. And among these things were various ethnological materials. things they had collected from the Indians, various kinds of specimens of animals, and of course these wonderful specimens of plants, various specimens of samples of minerals. And of course they had all kinds of other data as well. They had all their astronomical data, they had their map data, and all of this was kind of scattered around at this time. The plants supposedly had gone to Barton. Persh had taken them to England. The various items like this calumet pipe were in either the museum, personal museum of Clark that had been set up in St. Louis, or they ended up in Charles Wilson Peale's museum in Philadelphia. And the stuff never really was gotten together. The map material that was created, of course, became immensely important to the military and to the economic development of the country. And the Clark map was just constantly added to until it finally became a very complete and useful map. It was considered very useful right after the expedition, although it didn't look anything like this. But it had the major tributaries of the Missouri River drainage in it, and more information on the mountains. A lot of the information about latitude and longitude was close or correct, or it was way off. The astronomical data that was collected to deal with longitude was given to a person named Ferdinand Hassler, who was a mathematics teacher at West Point, and he worked that data up as best he could, indicating certain frustrations in letters he sent to Jefferson. The summary of the map-making efforts of the expedition is shown here. Nearly 100 maps of the route. Of course, you've got Gary Moulton's new edition of the Lewis and Clark Journals. You have one of those wonderful atlases that show these maps. The determination of the shortest route, they didn't find the inland waterway, as you know the story, but they did do a terrific job of describing the physical features along the way. So the cartographic data was probably as significant scientifically as anything that they did on the expedition. Peale, who was really kind of the father of museums in this country, was an acquaintance of Jefferson, and Jefferson saw to it that Peale got a lot of the materials from the expedition to put on exhibit. A great number of these things in the Peale Museum became the objects of examination by a whole new breed and new crop of naturalists. You may recall in the turn of the century, about the time of the expedition, the Linnaean system of naming things, the binomial system of using a genus and species, had just begun. That had started in the late 18th century by Linnaeus, a Swedish botanist, and it created a kind of order that people were just beginning to use. Lewis really didn't know this system well enough to use it, but the people that saw the materials immediately afterwards were just as much into that kind of science as people are into molecular biology and other kinds of modern sciences you hear about today. Peale made his collections available to a variety of people. He immediately saw Alexander Wilson. Wilson had been in this country for several years, was a friend of Lewis, wanted to go on the expedition. He was really the principal ornithologist of this country of the times. He created a wonderful American ornithology set of books, 9 volumes. They were beautiful illustrations, better, I think, than Audubon's pictures of the 1840s. And was a great friend of George Ord, who I'll say something about in just a minute. But Wilson, some said that I was reading one of the British, about one of the British painters who painted for the royal courts in England who said that Wilson almost looked like a bird. His nose was sharp, his eyes were kind of beady, and he had this appearance. He was a terrific ornithologist, poet. He was kind of a political guy, got thrown in jail a few times for his seditious tendencies and so forth. But he was a wonderful ornithologist, and he identified, gave generic and species names to these three birds that are shown here in this. His friend Alexander Lawson, who was the principal engraver at the time, in this engraving. They haven't been colored yet at this stage in this painting, but you can see the Clark's nutcracker on the left, and you can see Lewis's woodpecker, and over toward the up in the top, kind of middle there, the Kooskooskee river bird of the western tanager. George Ord was a good friend of Wilson's and kind of his defender when Wilson got into problems with Audubon. But these are a set of the animal materials that came back from the Lewis and Clark expedition that were in the museum of Charles Wilson Field. And each of these is one that George Ord identified and got credit for the identification, and of course gave Lewis and Clark credit for the discoveries. One of these, among the grizzly bear and all these other important finds, was the pronghorn antelope. Rafinesque, Constantine Rafinesque, was another prominent naturalist at the time. And he, from the museum materials of Peale, identified these animals. I just threw in one example of one of the animals that he identified and gave a scientific name to. It was a prairie rattlesnake. Another was Thomas Say. Thomas Say is considered today the father of entomology in this country. But Say used these animals from the museum collection to make identifications a number of years later in the 1820s. One of them was the coyote, and I used this Charlie Russell model I think you all know what a coyote looks like, but I figured you might not have seen Charlie Russell's coyote. Charles Bonaparte, there's a seagull named after Bonaparte. If you're a bird watcher, you know about Bonaparte's gull. But he gave the scientific name out of this collection of Lewis and Clark to the sage grouse, which was collected up by the Great Falls area. This is Clark's famous sketch of the cock of the plains, the sage hen or sage grouse. And the description was one of those terrific descriptions like we talked about a minute ago. And here's a picture of the bird. David Douglas did the mountain quail, and Prince Maximilian, who had his own natural history expedition in 1833, did the pinyon jay. It was called Maximilian's jay for a number of years, and then it was changed to pinyon jay. It feeds on the nuts of the pinyon pine. And there's a whole story, another hour's lecture on coevolution between pinyon jays and pinyon pines. We can't get to that today, but there's the bird. This guy, and I'm just about at the end of the slide, so you'll have an idea of where we are in this lecture. This was Elliot Cowes. Elliot Cowes came on the scene to the Lewis and Clark materials, and I won't go into great detail on it because I'm sure that Gary Moulton will talk about this in the history of the journals. But Cowes did get a chance to rewrite the history of the expedition, the Biddle edition, which had been published in 1814. And Cowes, who was had been in the Army, was a physician, was a naturalist, one of the original founders of the American Ornithological Union. He was a great ornithologist. Cowes did find the journals, all these different copies, all these different volumes. The American Philosophical Society, and with support from Harper's, did redo the journals for publication. And he in a sense, is the one who really cast the first recognition of the scientific significance of the expedition. Other than the cartographic discoveries, which we mentioned a minute ago, this is simply the copy of the Clark Journal. Simply an illustration of what Elliott Cowles was using. I threw it in just to make a comment that he did do the sin of editing these journals, as you probably know, and put his pen to the pages and corrected spelling and so forth. But I forgive him for that, for all the other things he did. The summary of scientific contributions that I wanted to make, and then comment on I think, the person who's created the best set of data, really, and needs the greatest recognition now for work in the natural history. But first of all, before I say that, these are a summary of the things that were discovered. 25 new species of birds, at least 134 species could be identified out of the journals, nearly 100 maps, descriptions of over 200 species of plants, ethnographic data on nearly 50 Indian tribes, meteorological and geological data. Paul Russell Cutright said that this was one of the most important exercises in the application of scientific practices and instrumentation attempted by the young republic. And as to Paul Russell Cutright, who I never met, I don't know what kind of a man he was, but what he's left in his works about the natural history of the Lewis and Clark expedition is another great contribution to this story. I end with that. Thank you very much.